Feuding is nothing new to those who live in the mountains. Some feuds carry on to this day and have lasted so long that most people don't know why they're supposed to hate the other family. One such case was the Hatfields and McCoys, the most famous feud in American history. Extended family and friends are often called clans. This is no way to be confused with the KKK, and the term clans will be used interchangeably with the word family when extended family is involved in the conflict. The Civil War caused a lot of havoc in the Appalachian Mountains, with important mountain crossings and river points becoming hotbeds of conflict between the North and the South that would change hands often. These crossings were important for supply lines and movement of troops. While slavery was not an issue in the Appalachians, the issue of states' rights versus government rights was very much in the forefront. This was a pre-coal mining days, so the conflict between the Appalachians and the coal mine barons would not happen for many decades yet still to come. Many series have been made about the feud, as well as documentaries, movies, books, pamphlets. Even Bugs Bunny had a couple of cartoons based around it. Star Trek did a huge nod to the feud with its Dr. Leonard Bones McCoy, now a dinner and show restaurant in Sevierville, Tennessee. It has been famous, infamous, maligned, and celebrated. Why all the fuss? Well, let's dive into the myth, the legend, and the facts of the Hatfield and McCoy feud. The Hatfields of West Virginia were led by William Anderson, Devil and Niece Hatfield, while the McCoys of Kentucky were under the leadership of Randolph O. Randall McCoy. The McCoy family lived mostly on the Kentucky side of the Tug Fork. The Hatfields lived mostly on the West Virginia side. The Pike County Guards of 1862, who were at that time led by William Francis, had shot and wounded Mose Christian Klein, and he survived these wounds. However, he was a close friend to Anse Hatfield, who swore to avenge the parties who were responsible for the shooting. Sometime in 1863, a group of Confederate home guards had ambushed and killed William Francis as he was leaving his house. Hatfield took the credit for the shooting. This is not the last time that the Klein family would be involved in the feud. Asa Harmon McCoy joined the 45th Kentucky Infantry on October 20th, 1863. During the early months of the war, Asa had joined the Pike County Home Guards under the command of Uriah Runyon. Uriah Runyon was killed by rebels on May the 7th, 1864. By December 1863, McCoy was captured by rebels and released 4 months later to a Union hospital where he was recovering from a gunshot to the chest. It is thought that he sustained a wound while serving his unit. May 6, 1864, suffering from a leg fracture, Asa is reported at being at Lexington Hospital. On December 24, 1864, the 45th Kentucky Infantry Company E was mustered out of service. Asa Harmon McCoy fought for the Union against his family. Just 13 days out of service on January 7, 1865, McCoy was confronted by and killed by the Logan Wildcats, who were a group of self-appointed home guards, enforcing their views of the law with violence and intimidation. They patrolled the roads and settlements on both sides of the Tug River in Logan County, West Virginia. The Logan Wildcats, which had Anse Hatfield and Jim Vance, who was one of Anese's uncles and known as Uncle Jim, as members. Both were from the Hatfield clan. Anse Hatfield also had considerable authority since he also employed many of the men in his timber operations. Anse Hatfield also held considerable authority since he also employed many of the men in his timber operations. Anse was found to be home and sick at the time of McCoy's death. However, Vance was suspected of the murder. A couple of Confederate guerrillas took credit for the killing, and McCoy's wife's pension application states that McCoy was killed by rebels. However, Vance to this day is considered to be the one that killed McCoy. There are no existing records of McCoy's death nor warrants for his murder. While the death of Asa Harmon McCoy is not considered to be the beginning of the feud, it is considered to be the start of bad blood between the two clans. After the war, Hatfield would employ many of the McCoy clan in his timber operations, while Randolph McCoy, known as Old Randall, would also run a similar business, having large land holdings, such as a farm of 300 acres, and livestock. He was not as financially well off as Hatfield. While there was some bad blood between the families over Asa's death, the two families often shared social connections and marriages. Valentine Hatfield Wall was the older brother to Anse. Valentine was content to let Anse make all of the decisions regarding the extended family, and this is why Anse is considered to be the patriarch of the family. As a justice of the peace, Wall made legal decisions which fed the feud on the West Virginia side by being ignored on the Kentucky side, during which members of both families changed sides, betraying family because of marriage or employment. A little something about how pigs and hogs are viewed in the Appalachian Mountains. They are their own food group. Just about every meal has some kind of pork in it somewhere. It's just the way it is. To steal a pig or to kill one is a serious offense because you basically are stealing from the table of a family. Floyd Hatfield, the cousin to Anse, had a hog. Randolph McCoy claimed that hog was his. There were notches in the pig's ear which gave credence that this was McCoy's hog and not a Hatfield's one. The matter was taken to a local justice of the peace, Anderson Preacher Anse Hatfield. The community that the trial took place in had a very heavy McCoy influence. However, Hatfield presided. Testimony was given by Bill Stanton, who was related to both families. He was a member of the McCoy extended family by blood, but had married into the Hatfield clan. Stanton had testified in Floyd Hatfield's favor. Justice Hatfield took his testimony into account and ruled for the Hatfields. He then removed the theft charge against Hatfield and allowed him to retain possession of the hog. In June 1880, Bill Stanton was killed by Sam and Paris McCoy. Sam stood trial for the killing and was found not guilty by means of self-defense. The actual reason behind this dispute is not clear. However, it is highly speculated that this was due to hard feelings that the McCoys had towards him for his testimony over the hog. In 1979, Family Feud had a special week of taping for the Hatfield and McCoys. It was once again a battle for a hog, as well as for some money. A hog was kept in the stage during the week-long competition. The McCoy family won the week with 3 games to 2. The Hatfields, however, had won more money, coming to $11,272 to the McCoys $8,459. The show came to the conclusion that the winners should have more money, and so they came to the decision of augmenting the McCoy family winnings to $11,273, thus giving them just $1 more than the Hatfield family. Now something for everyone who is not from the Appalachian Mountains should know. A couple can be wed without a marriage license. This goes on all of the time in the mountains to this day. Common law marriages are a real recognized part of life in the mountains. This goes back to the time of the circuit preachers, when you might see a preacher once a month or every 6 months, depending upon the time of year and weather. Another form of common law marriage is that the couple may be legally divorced but still living together. All of the children born under this arrangement are often considered to be legitimate, and the children do bear the father's last name in many cases. You can be divorced from someone by simply moving out of the house. This again goes to the common law marriage idea, and if a couple breaks up, they just separate and go their own ways. They also publicly declare that they are no longer a couple, and this is recognized as their divorce. In a common law marriage, both parties have to recognize that they are in this arrangement. They have to publicly declare each other as husband and wife, and this is where this part of the feud takes shape. Were they or weren't they married under these rules? A word about election days in Kentucky. Back in the 1800s, it was considered to be a great gathering of people. It was treated more of a social gathering than an election that we think of today. It was a time for everyone to get to know those that were running for office in their local districts and meet them face to face. It was not unheard of to have an informal family reunion at this time. It is not really known the date that Roseanna McCoy, Randolph McCoy's daughter, entered a relationship with Devil Anse's son, Johnson, also known as Johnse. However, it is also speculated that they met at an election day gathering in 1880 on Prairie Creek in Pike County, Kentucky. All we know for certain is that before 1881, she had left the McCoy family household to live with the Hatfields in West Virginia. According to history, Randolph was not thrilled by Roseanna's actions, as she did this without his knowledge or consent. Neither of the families would consent to the match. Now the following event takes place, according to which historian it is, relating the tale as to when it happens. It is unclear if this takes place when Roseanna takes up with the Hatfields for the first time, or when they reconcile. The McCoy family had Johnse arrested or kidnapped on an outstanding Kentucky bootlegging charge against him. When she learned of this, Roseanna made a midnight ride to alert Anse, who organized a party of men to rescue Johnse from his capture, as they were trying to transport him to Pikeville, Kentucky to face the charges. At gunpoint, the Hatfield clan rescued Johnse and brought him back to West Virginia, where Kentucky had no legal authority or standing. Despite this act of love for Johnse and her betrayal to her family, the McCoys, Johnse abandoned Roseanna, who was pregnant with their child, for her cousin Nancy McCoy, who was the daughter of Asa Harmon McCoy. Johnse and Nancy were legally wed in 1881. What is clear is that this was a very rocky relationship, as Roseanna evidently left the Hatfields to return to the McCoy family, which she also had a rocky relationship with her family as well. The child of Johnse and Roseanna would be born in the spring of 1881 and named Sarah Elizabeth McCoy. and she would die at the age of 8 months old of the measles. It is said that Randolph McCoy refused to recognize the child of Roseanna and Johnse, and also to speak to his daughter ever again. So her mother arranged for her to live with her Aunt Betty in Stringville, Kentucky. Roseanna died at the age of 29 to 31. Her gravestone is unclear of the year. The grave marker says that Roseanna died of grief and gave up her will to live. She never saw Johnse again. On August 5, 1882, on an election day in Kentucky, a deadly mix of contempt and alcohol came together. Before now, there had been raids, kidnappings, and lawsuits that caused the families to despise each other. However, this day, the violence had reached its tipping point. Three McCoy brothers, Tolbert, Farmer, and Bud, got into a drinking argument and brawl with Ellison Hatfield and his brother. Both were brothers of Anse. One view is that the McCoy brothers were angry about the treatment of their sister Roseanna by the Hatfield family. Ellison was stabbed 26 times and was killed by gunshot while he was laying on the ground. Some historians say that Ellison lived for a very short time after this incident. The McCoy brothers were arrested by the Hatfield constables and were on their way to Pikeville, Kentucky for trial. Anse Hatfield arranged for a large group of followers and forcibly took the McCoy prisoners before they reached Pikeville. Tolbert, Farmer, and Bud were taken by force to West Virginia and there killed by the Hatfields as vigilante justice. Each man was tied to a pawpaw tree and was shot several times. A total of 50 shots were fired at the men, and they were described as being bullet-riddled. Approximately 20 men, including Anse, were indicted for the murders, even though the people of the area considered the revenge to be warranted. All of the men eluded arrest and capture. This led to the McCoys taking their own vigilante justice. The McCoy family sought justice through Perry Cline, who was married to Martha McCoy. She was the widow of Asa McCoy. It is believed through Cline's influence and political connections to have the charges of murder of Tolbert, Farmer, and Bud reinstated, and have warrants placed for the capture and arrest of Devil and Niece Hatfield, Jim Vance, and others of the Hatfield clan, hoping to attract bounty hunters to the region to apprehend the fugitives in West Virginia and bring them back to Kentucky for trial. Perry Cline is a very controversial character among the historians and both families. He is often seen as the linchpin that caused the feud to escalate. The question becomes, was he seeking justice for himself or for the McCoys? One possible motive could have been many years before the Election Day brawl. Perry Cline had just lost a lawsuit against Anse Hatfield. The lawsuit was over a deed to 5,000 acres of land and timber rights. He is either demonized or canonized for his actions in the feud, depending on whose side you take in the dispute. Later in life, Cline was responsible for the first African American school in Pike County, Kentucky, and being a very skilled politician became Kentucky state representative. However, it is widely agreed that the portrayal of Perry Cline in the Kevin Costner's Hatfield and McCoys miniseries is not accurate. There is no love interest between Roseanna McCoy and himself because Cline was married at the time. Jeff McCoy killed Fred Wolford, who was a mail carrier. The reasons for this murder are currently unknown, as well as the connection to the feud. Acting Constable Cap Hatfield and his friend Tom Wallace were acting upon a warrant to arrest Jeff McCoy for this murder. Both men shot Jeff while he was trying to escape on the banks of the Tug Fork River. Tom Wallace was found dead in the spring of 1887. By this point, at the end of 1887, Randolph McCoy had lost 3 sons and a brother to the Hatfield family. His attempt to gain justice through political actions would turn into more tragedy for the family. New Year's night, 1888, is historically considered to be the beginning of the peak of the violence between the two feuding families. Cap Hatfield, Anse Hatfield's son, and Jim Vance, Anse Hatfield's uncle, led a group of Hatfields to the McCoy family cabin and opened fire in the middle of the night on the sleeping family. The cabin was then set on fire in an attempt to draw Randolph McCoy out into the open. McCoy escaped, however 2 of his children were shot and killed, Randolph's son Calvin and daughter Alifair, and his wife Sarah was beaten severely with a skull fracture and almost died of her injuries. The beating of Sarah is often assigned to Vance. The children and family members who escaped with Randolph McCoy suffered frostbite due to only being in night clothing and was unprepared for the cold night. The family moved to Pikeville in an attempt to end the night raids for the safety of the family. The beginning of the battle started when Deputy Sheriff Bad Frank Phillips and his posse that included Bud McCoy and one of Randolph's sons, James Jim McCoy, were commissioned by the Kentucky State Governor, Simon Buckner. They began tracking Anse Hatfield and his group of men across the border into West Virginia. On January 10th, Phillips arrested Cap Hatfield. Jim Vance was the first to die as he was killed resisting arrest in a wooded area. There are several who claim that Vance was killed after the party left, which included several McCoys that ran him down in the woods. Still others claim that Phillips took the law into his own hands and killed Vance himself. In several raids, Phillips was able to capture more conspirators, and 3 Hatfield supporters were killed in the attempts. Jim Vance is often seen as the loose cannon in the feud. It seems that Jim Vance was not a major player in the feud as many think. While he is historically at all of the major events of the dispute, he was not generally seen as an instigator, but more of just a member of the group as a whole, as the Hatfields saw him as a loving uncle. However, if you ask the McCoys, They saw Vance as a murderer who was mentally unhinged. Vance did become a constable in 1870, and at that same time he was deemed an outlaw of Pike County. Like many of the sheriffs and marshals of that time, it was not unusual to have a lawman wanted by the law in the next state or county over from where they served. It is a very complex society in the Appalachians, and very hard to actually grab a hold of that men of that time can be both sheriff and called devil or bad or other names due to some of the actions that they took. Deputy Sheriff Frank Phillips and his posse found Anse and the other Hatfields waiting upon them at Grapevine Creek. The largest gun battle of the feud began, which has made the feud legendary. But the Hatfields were eventually rounded up and arrested. Deputy Bill Dempsey, who was a Hatfield supporter, was wounded and executed by Deputy Sheriff Frank Phillips on the scene after the Hatfields had surrendered. This battle claimed more than a dozen lives from both sides of the feud. This feud had gotten to the point that the governors of the state of West Virginia and Kentucky got involved in the conflict. Kentucky Governor Simon B. Buckner sent his adjutant general, Sam Hill, to Pike County to investigate how the situation could be calmed. West Virginia State Governor E. Willis Wilson demanded that the men be returned to the state of West Virginia as their capture was deemed illegal and not recognized by the state. Wilson sued the state of Kentucky for the illegal arrest of the 9 prisoners being held in Pike County and demanded reparations for the raid into the state of West Virginia. Wilson also sent troops to the border of West Virginia to prevent further raids across the Tug River. In response, Buckner sent troops to the Kentucky state border to prevent any raids by either troops or Hatfields against the McCoys. It had only been 20 years since the Civil War, and once again the troops from 2 states were facing against each other. The Hatfields and their families were indicted for the murder of Asa McCoy and others for resisting arrest. Those listed in the indictment were the following: Cap Hatfield, Johnson, known as Johnse Hatfield, Robert Hatfield, Elliot Hatfield, Ellis and Cotton Top Mounts, French Ellis, Charles Gillespie, Thomas Chambers, Valentine Uncle Wall Hatfield, Doc D. Mahan, Pliant Mahan. Was Bad Frank Phillips an anti-hero or villain? Well, that just depends upon which side that you're taking with this feud. There are many stories of this time with his wild women, alcohol, and excessive force. Still, there are others who view him as taking the actions necessary to rein in one of Tug River's most wanted gang of criminals. Very little law and order was established, and it was not uncommon for families to take justice into their own hands. With Phillips' actions to arrest the Hatfields, the United States Supreme Court had to make a ruling as there were 2 states involved. just to make sure we understand where we are on the timeline of the Hatfield and McCoy feud so far. New Year's night, 1888. The cabin of Randolph McCoy was shot up and burned down. We have the confirmed deaths of two children, Calvin and Alifair McCoy. We have Sheriff Frank Phillips crossing the West Virginia border from Kentucky to arrest 9 men for the murders and several others for resisting arrest. There was a question as to the legality of this action. The governors of the state of Kentucky and West Virginia have now sent troops to their borders to stop other raids and trying to calm tensions. The Tug River Valley is in an uproar. This lawsuit will affect how bounty hunters will operate in the hunting of criminals when they cross over to other states for many years to come. On February 9, 1888, the governor of West Virginia presented to the District Court of the United States stating that on September 1887, the governor of the state of Kentucky requested the arrest of Pliant Mahon for the alleged charge of murder, and that he had fled to and was still at large in the state of West Virginia to avoid justice. He further petitioned that during the month of December 1887 or January 1888, the said Pliant Mahon, while a resident and residing in the state of West Virginia, was in violation of her laws, the Constitution, and the laws of the United States. Also that Mahon was arrested without warrant or legal process by a body of armed men from Kentucky, and by force and against his will was taken out of the state. At the same time as these events, another petition was presented to the court by one John A. Shepherd, stating that his case was also like that of Pliant Mahon's and that the governor's facts were true. Subsequently, the name of Pliant Mahon was substituted for that of John A. Shepherd, and the proceedings on the petition were conducted in his name. The court then placed an order for the jailer Abner Justice of Pike County, Kentucky, to bring the person of Pliant Mahon to the District Court of the United States in Louisville, Kentucky, on the 20th of that month, and there to abide until the decision was made in the case. The Pike County jailer's response was that Mahon was being held in the Pike County jail under the obedience of the 3 arrest warrants issued by the clerk of the criminal court of the county. Under these warrants, Mahon was being held for the crime of willful murder that had been alleged to have been committed in the county, a crime for which the court had full jurisdiction. The jailer was proceeding to the city of Louisville to produce the body of Mahon before the United States District Court, where he was met on the way by a United States Marshal of the District of Kentucky. The United States Marshal had then taken custody of Mahon by the order of the District of Kentucky. Abner Justice further replied that the 3 indictments against Mahon and the others for the willful murder of the McCoy children were found by the grand jury of Pike County, Kentucky, stating that the grand jury had jurisdiction over the case at the time. Believing these statements by the grand jury to be authentic and true, it was certified by the governor of Kentucky, and the said governor appointed Frank Phillips as the agent of the state to receive and bring to the state Mr. Mahon as provided by law in such cases. On or about January 12, 1888, Frank Phillips and others with force of arms, did violently seize upon and capture Mahon, and did bring him against his will to face charges in the state of Kentucky. In his statement, Justice went on to further reply that no arrest warrant was issued against Mahon by the governor of the state of West Virginia in compliance with said requisition. That on January 30th, 1888, replied to the governor of the state of Kentucky that after investigation of the facts and being fully satisfied in the case, that he could not find guilt in Mahon for the crime in which he was being charged. Then on February 1st, 1888, the governor of the state of West Virginia demanded from the governor of the state of Kentucky the release of Mahon from Pike County Jail, and his safe return to the state of West Virginia. The governor of the state of Kentucky denied this request, stating that it was not in the duties and powers of the acting governor of West Virginia to determine the matter, but a case for the courts, and further held Mahon in custody pending trial. On March 3, 1888, the courts denied the motion for the release of Mahon, and the marshal was then ordered to return Mahon to the custody of the jailer, Abner Justice, awaiting further court actions. The Supreme Court became involved in the feud in 1888. The case is listed under Mahon v. Justice, 127 U.S. 700, 1888. The state of West Virginia argued that Pliant Mahon should be released from confinement, set free, and returned in safety to the state of West Virginia, as Mahon had been illegally arrested, seized, and confined in the common jail of Pike County, and deprived of his liberty by the state of Kentucky. The state of Kentucky argued that the prisoner in custody should remain so until the trial, and that the state was under no obligation to release them to the state of West Virginia or any other entity, regardless as to how they were arrested and retained. Mahon's attorney argued that the governor of the state of West Virginia was considering an application from the governor of the state of Kentucky as a fugitive from justice when he was forcibly abducted by Phillips. Mahon's attorneys also made the argument that he was then seized by the Kentucky state authorities under legal process and was not entitled to be discharged from the custody under a writ of habeas corpus from the Circuit Court of the United States. The Supreme Court of the United States of America ruled 7-2 in favor of Kentucky. The Supreme Court issued no finding or opinion on the question of legality of the arrest of the group of men. However, they did agree with the state of Kentucky that at that time no law existed which prohibited the trial of the men for the murder to continue. The trial would carry on regardless of how they were arrested and brought into the state. The two dissenting judges, Mr. Justice Harlan and Mr. Justice Bradley, both agreed that the writ of habeas corpus was properly issued and the prisoner Mahon should have been discharged and released from custody, that he was being held against his will, and this was contrary to the Constitution and the laws of the United States. Both judges felt that he was kidnapped and was carried into the state of Kentucky by force, which is a plain violation of the Constitution of the United States, and for him to continue to remain in the state of Kentucky was a violation of his constitutional rights. While it is true that Mahon was charged with a crime in the state of Kentucky, the Constitution provides for a peaceful remedy for procuring the surrender of the persons charged with a crime for fleeing to another state. Such laws and treaties were put into place between the states for just such events. It was felt by these two dissenting judges that the states could take justice into their own hands and demand of each other reparations for illegal invasions of their states, if this ruling was also allowed to stand. That also that the parties who were injured legally or otherwise could resort to reprisals or other measures that they might deem necessary in order to obtain justice. It is interesting that Anse Hatfield was not among those that were arrested and tried. Neither Kentucky or West Virginia sought for his arrest in any of the events that took place, even though his location was well known and a bounty of $500 was placed upon his person at one point during the feud. Anse Hatfield was never charged with the murders of the three McCoy brothers, or for the shooting of the two young McCoy children, or the beatings, kidnappings, or other things that were done, even though he was also known to use the courts to his advantage when it came to matters between the two clans in the feud. When the main trial was over, Hatfield was not on the run after that point in history. Many have pointed out that it may have been Hatfield's political connections that kept him from being arrested. However, his brother Wall had similar connections and thus was arrested, tried, and convicted and sent to prison. The stage is now set. The players are at their marks. The curtain begins to open for all to see. Because not all of the trials were held at one time, there are individual rulings. The trials spanned from 1889 to 1901. One of the most controversial characters of the feud has to be Mounts, and he is also the only person to have been hung for the crimes. Sometime in August 1864, Ellison was born in Logan County, West Virginia. He was the illegitimate son of Ellison, who was killed in the Election Day 1882 brawl, and his first cousin, Harriet Hatfield. Harriet married Daniel Mounts in 1887, and Ellison was raised by him. On December 25, 1882, Ellison married Rebecca Justice, the daughter of Jacob Justice and Elizabeth Farrell. There is no record of any children being born in this marriage. Ellison is often described as being dim-witted at that time, so he was possibly mentally handicapped, and also an albino as he had white hair, hence his name Cotton Top. However, he is also described as being mean and vicious, earning his place and reputation among his kinfolk. However you view Mounts, his story is an interesting one. Mounts tried to retract his confession because he claims he made it to be shown leniency, but the retraction was denied. It is also thought, since Mounts was very well known to have a mental handicap, that leniency would also be allowed on those grounds as well. There were also rumors that he had been promised a bribe and pressured to give a confession with the promise of a rescue. This did not happen, and he was sentenced to hang by a jury regardless of how the confession happened and despite a guilty plea. Testimony also came out that Cap Hatfield was the cause behind the murders, but this was not taken into consideration. On February 18, 1890, he was hung in Kentucky's last public execution and buried in an unmarked grave within the sight of the gallows. His last words were reportedly, quote, "They made me do it. The Hatfields made me do it," unquote. It is unclear if he meant his participation in the shooting and burning of the McCoy cabin New Year's night 1888, or if it was because of his forced confession. Even though Kentucky had officially stopped public executions, thousands of people attended his hanging in Pikeville. Although the gallows were open and people could view the hanging, a fence was placed around the gallows in compliance with the law of the time, stating that there were no more public executions. The current site of the execution is now a classroom building for the University of Pikeville. Mount's last words, quote, "The Hatfields made me do it," unquote. The only hanged man for the feud and the last man to be hanged from the gallows in Pike County, Kentucky. Before Mount's 40 years had passed since the last public execution, and after Mount's, no one was ever executed in the city again. Mount's is buried in an unmarked grave at Dill Cemetery in Pikeville, Kentucky. William Anderson Cap Hatfield II was the second son of Anse Hatfield and his wife Lavista Chafin. He got his nickname Captain from the Civil War, which was later shortened to Cap. He was born February 6, 1864 in Mingo County, West Virginia. He married Nancy Elizabeth Smith on October 11, 1883, and they had several children together. When Cap's older brother Johnse removed himself from the feud, Cap took his place as Anse's lieutenant. Cap's nature of being of a quarrelsome disposition and his love of violence were legendary in the mountains. He was a man that preferred to settle things with his fists and guns rather than to talk things over with a discussion. He believed that it was his duty to be offended and to exact vengeance. He is also known to have killed Jeff McCoy in 1886, for which he was never charged or convicted for this crime, and at one time was a deputy sheriff of Logan County, West Virginia. There are conflicting reports as to when Cap was arrested. Some say he was arrested on the day his Uncle Jim Vance was killed. Others say that he escaped that day but was arrested on another day. However, he did spend time at the Logan County jail, which later became Mingo County, and he did escape. There is a lot of testimony from the McCoys that Cap was the ringleader of the New Year's Night Massacre. Randolph McCoy gave testimony that it was Cap that killed his daughter Alifair that night. Since this testimony conflicted with the confession of Mounts, it was discarded. However, because of his escape, he eluded justice and was never brought to trial. He died August 22, 1930, at the age of 66 at Johns Hopkins Hospital of a brain ailment in Baltimore, Maryland. Valentine Uncle Wall Hatfield was convicted for the involvement of the murders of the McCoy children. He might not have been involved in the attack that sent him to prison for life. Other than family lore, there is no evidence that Hatfield was or was not among the group of men accused and convicted of the murders. However, Hatfield died in the cell block claiming that he was innocent of the charges against him. Johnson, known as Johnse Hatfield, was the oldest son of Anse Hatfield. He was born on January 6, 1862. He was the last person to be sentenced in the trial for the murders of Alifair and Calvin McCoy. It took 10 years for his case to come to a jury. He served 13 years of his life sentence. He is buried at the Hatfield Cemetery, Sarah Ann, Logan County, West Virginia. He is forever remembered as the Romeo of the Appalachian Mountains. Pliant Mahon was the son-in-law of Valentine Hatfield. After a disappointing case going through the Supreme Court, Pliant Mahon was sentenced to life in prison. After serving 14 years in prison before returning home to rejoin his ex-wife, who had since remarried. However, she left her second husband to rejoin Pliant. Doc D. Mahon was the brother of Pliant and also the son-in-law to Valentine Hatfield. Doc also served a 14 years of a life sentence involving the McCoy children's death. After prison, he returned home to live with his son, Melvin. The other men who were convicted of the murders were Robert Hatfield, who spent life in prison, Elliot Hatfield, life in prison, French Ellis, life in prison, Charles Gillespie, life in prison, and Thomas Chambers, life in prison. Between the years of 1880 and 1888, there had been more than a dozen people die and 10 people wounded on both sides of the conflict. 8 of the 9 Hatfield family members were given life sentences, and 1 was hanged for the crimes. Over the next couple of years, there were other trials and convictions for their roles in the feud. However, both sides pretty much gave up on continuing the feud at this point in time. Altogether, the feud had lasted only 30 years. In 1891, Cap Hatfield published a letter in the local newspaper in the Baltimore Sun that read in part, quote, "The war spirit in me has abated. A general amnesty has now been declared in the famous Hatfield and McCoy feud," unquote. Both sides had major losses in the family, and they declared amnesty from the fight. In the year 2000, Randolph McCoy's great-great-great-grandsons, Beau and Ron McCoy, organized a joint family reunion of the two families. This held great national attention as the family had never come together before. More than 5,000 people were in attendance. On June 14, 2003, in Pikeville, Kentucky, the McCoy cousins partnered with Rio Hatfield of Waynesboro, Virginia, to declare the official truce between the families. This concludes the last of the actual feud proper that will be covered in this series. However, in our next series of videos, we will cover the Matewan War, the battle for Blair Mountain, which is often regarded as a continuation of the feud. We hope that you have enjoyed this series on the feud so far. Thank you for watching.